Bonjour tout le monde, vous écoutez le Book Owl podcast. Get out of here, Frenchy Owl. Mais we are talking about the food, so you should have the Frenchy podcast. No, this is the Book Owl podcast still. Hello, au revoir, goodbye, Frenchy Owl. Sorry, everyone. Anyway, this is Tammy Painter, and you're listening to the Book Owl podcast, the podcast where I entertain your inner book nerd with tales of quirky books and literary lore. And the reason Frenchy Owl came and took over is because this time we're going to be talking about food. Well, sort of. Let me first offer up a very happy Thanksgiving to my listeners in the U.S. I hope everyone is keeping their distance and that you've definitely got a plan in place for all that leftover turkey. And because Thanksgiving is a holiday all about food, and especially food we don't normally cook, I mean, seriously, at what other point in the year do you suddenly think, oh my god, I just have to make cranberry sauce? I just thought this would be an excellent time to explore a type of book many Americans will be cracking open this Thursday. But before we start, just a quick reminder that you help keep this show running. And I really need to offer up a very belated thank you to Lavelle for being a continued sponsor of the show with her monthly gift. And she's been doing this since the show started, so I really feel bad that I haven't said thank you. Unless you're feeling especially flush with money, there's no need for you to be quite so generous. But I do want to remind you that you can help the show out by doing nothing more than your normal shopping you plan to do on Amazon this holiday season. Anytime you feel the itch to purchase a pack of dog food, a new pair of yoga pants, or maybe a book that you intend to give as a gift but end up keeping for yourself, well, before you start doing any of that shopping, just please head to the bookowlpodcast.com/support and use the Amazon link you'll find on that page to do your shopping. That's an affiliate link, and it does not cost you anything extra, but it does earn me an itty-bitty commission that really does add up. Okay, enough of that. So, if you're going to be in the kitchen this week, I bet at some point you're going to be reaching for a cookbook of some sort, which had me curious about the history of these most valuable kitchen tools. Well, okay, in my opinion, the electric kettle that keeps me fueled with tea is the most valuable tool, but, cookbooks, they run a very close second. Alright, so on to the history of cookbooks. It turns out the oldest cookbook, or at least the oldest one that's been discovered so far, dates from around 1700 BCE, and it has no pages. Okay, wait, let me clarify that. It's actually a collection of a handful of recipes on a series of 4 clay tablets that are part of what's known as the Yale tablets. And no, they weren't unearthed on the grounds of Yale University. They're called the Yale tablets because they're housed in the Yale Peabody Museum as part of the Yale Babylonian collection. A lot of Yales going on there. Anyway, the main recipe on these tablets is a meat stew that contains meat, obviously, vinegar, and herbs. And it's said to resemble a stew that was so adored by kings, it ended up being written about in stories for over 300 years. And just like we do when we find an interesting recipe in a magazine, some researcher was looking at this thing and said, hey, let's give it a try. So in 2018, a few brave folks from New York University recreated the stew as best they could with modern equivalents of the ingredients on the tablets. And the result? Well, it turns out it was pretty darn tasty, and I'll include a link to their experiment in the show notes. So, we're going to move up about 1800 years or so, and we get to the 1st century Common Era. And here we find the earliest European cookbook called the De Re Coquinaria. And I'm no Latin scholar, but I think that translates to something like From the King's Kitchen. And if there is a Latin scholar out there, please let me know if that's right or wrong. So, regardless of what it actually means, this book was supposedly compiled by the Roman Marcus Gavius Apicius. And he was the celebrity gourmand of the day, and he and his book were so influential that any collection of recipes came to be known as an Apicius for decades to come. Now, in ancient Rome, the goal of cooking and what chefs gained fame for was, being able to take your main food item, say poultry or something, and flavoring it and covering it up so much you could not tell what you were eating. This was not because the Romans loved eating the surprise du jour. It was because, well, how do I put this? Let's just say they didn't exactly have refrigerators and they weren't exactly bringing in fresh meat every day. And I really hope this isn't familiar to you, especially today on Thanksgiving. But the cooks had to do everything they could to hide the taste of the rotting meat they were serving up. I know, yum, right? So, stepping away from Europe for just a bit and jumping forward again in time, and I know you haven't traveled this much in months, have you? We're going to pop over to China, where there are reports of cookbooks dating all the way back to the Tang Dynasty, which extended from the year 600 to 900. But some pesky person lost those cookbooks. Or maybe there was a kitchen mishap and they spilled soy sauce all over them, who knows? Either way, the earliest surviving Chinese cookbook dates from about 1330. And I am not going to attempt the Chinese name for the book, but in English it translates to the name Important Principles of Food and Drink. And I really hope the recipes inside weren't as bland as that title. So, okay, we're going to zip back over to Europe, and here we find medieval Germans really like to cook. Or at least they really like cookbooks, because it's here we find the most cookery manuscripts from this era. And these include Das Buch von guten Spise, sorry for my German pronunciation, which translates to the Book of Good Food, and that's from 1350. And probably this should come as no surprise, but the Germans were also the first to employ our friend the printing press to publish a cookbook in 1485. And that book had the name Küchenmeisterei, or Kitchen Mastery, which I think has a rather modern marketing ring to it. And again, this should come as no surprise, but the French also had a few cookbooks on their shelves. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but the cookbooks we're talking about from this time period, from early Rome up until, the 1300s, 1400s, these books were really intended not for use at home, but for chefs who were cooking for the highest levels of society, including the king. And so, for example, these French cookbooks, the earliest one we have was written in the 14th century by Guillaume Tirel, and he was the master chef for not one, but two French kings. But we also have a little rebel in France, and as far as I could tell, this might be the earliest cookbook written for, common people or women making food for their families. We're done. We are taking French? No, Frenchie, go away, Frenchie owl. We don't need you. Okay, but if you need me, I'll be here. Okay, thank you. Anyway, this was Le Ménagier de Paris, or The Householder of Paris, and it was written by a middle-class Parisian for other middle-class Parisians. Jeez, what an idea. Of course, there were also cookbooks from Italy, Spain, the Middle East, and India, but since I'm a self-centered English speaker, let's just head right back up to England, where we'll find the first cookbook written in English. And this one dates from 1390, and it was penned by the chef of King Richard II, and had the intriguing title, Form of Curry. And now I really want some curry. But I think actually the word curry back then kind of just meant any type of stew. So there's probably not a spicy vindaloo recipe hidden amongst the pages, which is kind of disappointing. And also might be false advertising, I'm not sure. Okay, let's get back. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Germans were the first to crank out a cookbook from the printing press. And the printing press was responsible for kicking off a wave of cookbook publishing in the 1600s, when we see just a huge profusion of books coming out for household management and food preparation. And you're going to need that advice because right around this same time, especially for some reason in Holland and England, it becomes quite the trendy thing to see who amongst your ritzy friends can throw the most lavish banquets. And thanks to those lavish banquets, this is also when we really start seeing food preparation being turned into an art form. And, well, let's be honest, that artwork is probably still being used to cover up the taste and smell of meat that's gone off. There's just no getting around that until we get refrigerators. As is still happening today, because of these lavish banquets and the fame of the chefs, chefs just start becoming celebrities. households start fighting over hiring the most renowned cooks, and the chefs themselves start competing pretty viciously with each other to see who can write the most popular cookbook. Which, I don't know, it kind of sounds like the setup for an amazing historical novel full of bitchy backstabbing, and I kind of want to write that book. But, okay, enough of Europe. Let's take a quick hop over the pond to America, where we find Amelia Simmons in 1796 writing the book American Cookery, which she declared was adapted to this country and all grades of life. And as the article from Book Riot I used as part of my research, they kind of snarkily note that there weren't a lot of grades of life who could afford to purchase cookbooks, so this was probably intended mainly for the upper class. But the book did manage to stay in publication for 30 years. And also in my research, I found an interesting link to or correlation between the American Civil War and the rise of cookbooks in the American South. See, most middle and upper class households had, shall we say, free labor running their kitchens. When slavery was abolished and the freed people said, "I'm out of here," the white ladies, they were kind of left in the lurch. And some of these white households could probably still afford to hire cooks, whether those cooks were black or white. And okay, if we're being realistic, that hired help was probably mostly black. But many other former slave owners had lost their free labor, which also meant they lost a cheap way to make gobs of money, which also meant they were left to do their own cooking. Well, after years of being tended to by unpaid servants, these white ladies had little idea what to do in the kitchen. Luckily, as I said, during this time there was an explosion of cookbooks coming out in the South, and one of the books that appeared was written by Melinda Russell. Melinda was a freed slave who, in her book, she used the euphemism that she was an experienced cook. No mention that that experience came from forced unpaid labor, but anyway. Her recipes start to show a pattern in presentation that would continue to evolve, including putting a list of the ingredients at the start of the recipe. And unfortunately, because the cookbooks around this time were still written with the assumption that you knew what in the world you were doing in the kitchen, the amount of ingredients, they still required a bit of guesswork. Like, some of the recipes would just be like, put in 1 or 2 eggs, put in some flour. And it's not really until about 1845, with the release of Modern Cooking for Private Families by Eliza Acton, that we start to get not only a book written entirely for the home cook, but we also get the format we know today with the list of ingredients, the full instructions for what to do with those ingredients, and precise cooking times. And fun fact of the episode, it's also the first cookbook in the US to have a recipe for Brussels sprouts. Of course, you're going to go out and tell everybody that now, aren't you? Anyway, while Eliza's book had plenty of information, it could still be a bit vague. There were no standardized tools at the time, so cookbooks, they didn't exactly bother to pinpoint exact amounts of ingredients or the temperature of your stove or oven. For example, one book told people to heat water until it was a little warmer than the temperature of milk coming straight from the cow, which totally has me picturing some poor woman running back and forth from her stove to the barn to keep checking on things. It's not until the early 20th century before we start seeing more precise recipes. And that's because we finally get standardized measuring cups and measuring spoons. And something for which I'm very grateful, we moved away from wood-burning stoves and ovens whose temperatures couldn't be regulated to electric gas and stoves that could be set to a specified temperature. And as soon as these things started coming into play, the cookbooks started quickly incorporating these modern marvels into their recipes. And we're almost done here, but just to wrap up, we can't get away from cookbooks without mentioning the best-selling cookbook of all time, the Betty Crocker Cookbook. Betty, as you may know, doesn't really exist. And if you didn't know that, you're also going to be really disappointed when you learn about Santa. Anyway, Betty was completely made up by the company that would later become known as General Mills. And she came about because people kept writing in asking questions about the company's products. So kind of like a cooking Dear Abby, they created Betty to answer the questions. And they chose the name Betty because it sounded friendly and cheery, and Crocker was the last name of the company's recently retired director. This imaginary Betty Crocker was born in 1921, and she became hugely popular. And just like many celebrities, she eventually had to come out with her own cookbook. The first Betty Crocker cookbook was published in 1950, and it not only contained recipes, but also practical household tips and plenty of sympathy and understanding for the trials and tribulations of the mid-century housewife. The book was so popular, it outsold the Bible in its first year of publication, and since then, it's sold over 65 million copies. And yes, I do have my own tattered copy in my kitchen. So that's about it for my quick history of cookbooks. But as I was doing this, as I came to the end of the research, I couldn't resist researching just one more thing related to cookbooks. And that thing is the weirdest cookbooks out there. As you might guess, it generated some hilarious hits, and I'll be sharing those with everyone who is on the Book Owl podcast newsletter. And if you want to get that newsletter, yep, there's a link in the show notes. I guess that means it's time for updates. As for the podcast, there's not much to report. Just keep listening and keep recommending the show to others, and I'll keep trying to crank out episodes. Of course, if you have an idea for a book or an author or a bit of literary lore you'd like me to explore, feel free to contact me with your topic ideas by using the link in the show notes. And as for writing updates, I've been putting together all the parts to get my Cassie Black Trilogy ready for release early next year. And that means getting titles and covers and descriptions together for all 3 books. Fun stuff. I've also formatted and put in an order for proof copies of the paperbacks for the first 2 books. Book 3 isn't to that point yet, but it's getting closer. And I'm also going on a mad spree these last couple weeks of November in writing a stockpile of blog posts for my writing blog to share Cassie's creation, inspiration, and quirks with the world over the next few months. And I know, big surprise, but there's a few links for those blog posts in the show notes if you'd like to see the process of coming up with titles and the evolution of the book's cover design, and loads of other stuff. Okay, my home cooks, that is it for this episode. Stay safe, keep your distance, don't eat too much, and I will hoot at you next time. The Book Owl Podcast is a production of Daisy Dog Media. Copyright 2020, all rights reserved. The theme music was composed by Kevin MacLeod.